Right, so this story might sound crazy. It might sound like something out of Warhammer 40k even. But I promise you it isn't. It's being reported by several perfectly credible sources and certainly warrants an explanation, because it would appear Israel is using some kind of weapon, the likes of which I've certainly never heard of before. And upon further investigation, this is actually not a new story at all, but one which goes back at least as far as May of this year, so known about for months, and yet no investigation has been carried out into the multiple claims of what this disturbing apparent munition that Israel has and is deploying actually does. Because if the claims are true, this might explain, at least in part, the discrepancy between the number of Palestinians that have officially been killed by Israel in the aftermath of the night of October 7th, because it is very difficult to count a body when there's not much body left to actually count. Right, so Israel and its apparent use of a very strange weapon that does terrifying things to the human body. This actually sounds like something straight out of a science fiction novel. Something that, if it came out on a crank right-wing podcast or something, I wouldn't bat an eyelid at and take no notice of. But this has been reported in multiple different publications, at least since last May. And again in the last few days, as Hamas have now formally demanded that an international committee be formed to investigate claims regarding this weapon Israel is accused of using. So let's start with that statement, which reads, "We demand the formation of an international committee to investigate the use of internationally prohibited weapons by the terrorist occupation army in the northern Gaza Strip that lead to the evaporation of bodies. The horrific testimonies given by citizens and doctors in the northern Gaza Strip after the raids and massacres carried out against innocent civilians, and the confirmation of cases of targeting with weapons and ammunition that lead to the evaporation of bodies, strongly indicate the use of internationally prohibited weapons by the terrorist occupation army during the brutal extermination campaign that has been ongoing for 53 days in the northern Gaza Strip. We call on the international community and the United Nations to form a specialized international investigation committee, enter the northern Gaza Strip, and reveal the nature of the ammunition used by the fascist occupation army that leads to these injuries and unknown cases, and the truth of the widespread violations of international laws against unarmed civilians, which have so far led to the martyrdom of nearly 3,000 and the injury of more than 10,000 of our people, most of whom are women and children. The international community, the United Nations, and our Arab and Islamic countries are required today to stand up to their responsibilities to stop these violations and massacres that have continued in the Gaza Strip for 420 days, through which the occupation defies all laws, human values, and international political and judicial institutions, and to expedite bringing the Zionist war criminals to account for their crimes against humanity. Israel is being accused of using some sort of weapon that vaporizes bodies. This isn't Star Trek, this is the Zionist apartheid state of Israel, it seems, and where so many are missing, presumed dead, but where their bodies haven't been found, where the assumption has always been that they remain buried in rubble. This allegation casts a slightly different light on what may have come to pass in some cases, and that although there will certainly be bodies buried across the Gaza Strip, not necessarily every missing person lies there waiting to be found. Now you might be thinking, Damo, you've been drinking the Kool-Aid here, and going off on a statement by Hamas when you might not particularly trust them, and you might not necessarily take much stock in the other sources I might have looked at. But I've seen this story, this weapon, referenced in the Cradle, Middle East Eye, the New Arab, and even via a press release from Euromed Monitor, a service provided via the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the OCHA. So this isn't science fiction, this isn't some crank conspiracy story either, it would appear. Something is certainly going on. And that OCHA-backed coverage, which came out on the 1st of May this year, so the more recent reports show this is an issue that has largely been ignored, certainly ignored by mainstream media, of which there is zero coverage. So again, I implore you, if you don't read independent and alternative media yet, well, you're watching it here, so check out some of those aforementioned sources as a good place to start as well, because you really are missing out on a lot of real news by not doing so. Anyway, here's an excerpt from the Euromed story, the UN-backed coverage, describing what was being reported last May. Testimonies received by Euromed Human Rights Monitor reveal a horrific new level of killing in the Strip. Victims whose bodies appear to have evaporated or melted as a result of Israel's bombing of residential homes. The Israeli army's use of massive destruction in entire residential squares during its genocidal war on the Gaza Strip has resulted in a shockingly high number of casualties. This raises fears about the potential use of thermal weapons, or what are known as vacuum bombs, which are well known in military circles for their efficacy in demolishing caves and underground tunnel complexes. Thousands of victims remain missing, either because it was impossible to recover them from under the debris in light of insufficient equipment and technical know-how, or because their bodies are either hidden by the Israeli army or no longer exist. A number of the victims killed in these horrifying Israeli raids on residential buildings have vanished and may have turned to ashes, raising questions about the type of bombs used in the attacks. Now, accusations of the use of these weapons has been aimed predictably at Russia by the West for some time, but Israel potentially using them, well, that's just gone by the by. These so-called vacuum bombs are also referred to as poor man's nuclear weapons, amongst other names, because of the sheer devastation they cause and due to the nature of the damage, not to mention the effects such devices can have on the human body. The use of these devices in populated areas could be considered indiscriminate and a war crime, but the circumstances of their use dictate that, so investigation is required, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The proper name for these things, however, is thermobaric weaponry. Thermobaric meaning heat and pressure. They are absolutely horrible devices. A two-stage munition designed to cause massive levels of devastation. They get launched as a rocket or an artillery shell, and the first explosion spreads an aerosol containing a flammable chemical, something like petrol, across a given area. Then the second explosion then ignites this fog of flammable aerosol still floating in the air, which then creates a huge blast, flames, a massive pressure wave, and a vacuum as all of the oxygen in the area gets sucked up. The effect that has on the human body, well, if you read up on it, it can get very graphic. So I won't go to that degree. Suffice to say, the vacuum totals your lungs, the pressure wave pretty much ruptures all of your organs and soft tissues, and the flames and heat then incinerate what is left. It is possibly one of the most horrific ways to die I've read up on, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But then I'm not the IDF, and I'm not the one apparently using these things in Gaza. Some publications say people are vaporized, others turn to ash. I dare say proximity may play a part in that. But to say this needs investigating is clearly an understatement. And with the New Arab having published an article on people being vaporized just this morning, this can't happen soon enough, because clearly it is still happening. Here's a short snippet of their coverage entitled, "Israel continues to pound Gaza as top medic says bodies vaporizing." The Palestinian Wafa news agency said there was indiscriminate shelling in Absan al-kabira in southern Khan Yunis, with witnesses stating there was widespread fear amongst residents that this could be a prelude to a new ground incursion in the area. On Sunday, 3 separate Israeli attacks killed at least 47 Palestinians and wounded over 108 others, Wafa reported. The strikes across the enclave come as the director of the health ministry in Gaza, Dr. Munir al-bursh, announced that medical staff have noted Israeli forces using internationally prohibited weapons that are causing bodies to vaporize in Gaza. The director of the health ministry in Gaza is saying this as well. Bodies are being vaporized. Are these thermobaric devices what are being used now in central Gaza? Who'd put it past Israel to do so? Who'd put anything past them at this point, really? This is a shocker. Still, though, and honestly, if not for several different independent media outlets, not to mention the UN, having covered a story of bodies being vaporized, and it not being a nuclear weapon itself, of course, I would have struggled to believe it, not being familiar with this type of weaponry, not believing such things capable of this kind of damage even exist, and are even being used, therefore. It is barbaric, unhinged, and inhuman to intentionally use these sort of devices in areas where you know there will be people. That constitutes a war crime. These weapons are banned from use in such circumstances, apparently, though frankly, what circumstances they could be used in and not constitute a war crime, I can't fathom. They fall into a loophole, apparently, in the Geneva Conventions over the type of munition they are versus their intended effect. So for some reason, they don't count as an incendiary, despite there being flames. Go figure. Either way, it's another war crime to add to the ever-growing list being mounted against Israel, and absolutely has to be investigated, and therefore needs highlighting. So please do share this story. Get the word out there before this gets swept under the carpet again, as appears to have happened back in May. Meanwhile, if you're not already of a mind that Zionism and Israel deserve nothing but absolute damnation for their actions in Gaza against Palestine and against Palestinian people, then you absolutely need to hear this speech delivered by Palestinian author Susan Abu Hawa at the Oxford Union the other day, a debate there very much lost by the Zionists, and in no small part due to this speech in my mind, which is probably the most hard-hitting and eloquent takedown of Israel and Zionism I have ever heard. You absolutely need to hear this if you haven't already in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do like, share and subscribe to the channel to support it if you haven't already, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers folks.